Okay, so how's everybody? Yeah, good. Yeah, me too. So there's snow on the ground here in Salt Lake and it's cold and I'm ready for spring. Right? I spent most of my life in Seattle, so you'd think I'd be used to the cold, but it's not cold there like it is here in Utah. So if anybody has any questions or comments or anything you want to bring up about any old thing, be happy to answer. And then when Kenjin comes on, then I'll hand it over to him. No, nobody's got a question. Anybody want to tell a story, a fun story or anything like that? Hi, Juan.
Sorry,
Where are
I
you?
just well, I'm in California, San Francisco Bay Area. So the inside of the room is really cold, but outside is warm.
Oh, boy, that's beautiful behind you there.
Oh, you mean here? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I do want to share something.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, because it's really, really interesting this semester, because I'm a student, still a student now. So
Mhm.
yeah, this semester I selected a class called Chan and Zen Buddhism. So in that class, I noticed a lot of classmates are trying to understand Zen from here.
Yeah.
So, and also because last year I was with Genpo Roshi, so
Mm.
experienced that kind of so-called, enlightenment moment. So I noticed myself was a kind of, what's that, arrogant? I don't know.
Maybe,
Just to have that feelings in the class, especially in the first several classes, when they trying to discuss, understand what is Zen, what is enlightenment, what is mind, heart, mind. I was just like, have that attitude. I noticed that. That's really, really interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. And then I kind of feel myself is a little bit, um, how should I say? I annoyed by myself, like that arrogant. Mm, I
Yeah.
don't know, just want to share this in this group.
Well, let me say that um, what's great is that you have awareness of your own internal states and you notice your arrogance and then you notice your annoyance or maybe guilt over your arrogance and things like that. And that's one of the most important things about Zen is to be aware of where you're at and where you're coming from, your interior states. Regarding college classes on Zen, Dogen in the Shobogenzo has a very interesting fascicle in there. And he says you have to study the Buddha way with body and mind. And he goes on to elaborate that, with the mind, it's reading the sutras, it's studying the ancestry, it's the koans, it's commentaries, all that. And with the body, it's more about meditation and how you carry yourself and how you speak and your thoughts, speech, and actions, basically, and that these two things do work together. Like Roshi often says, the wings of a bird, you have to have both sides, or else you just go around in circles all the time. But I know from my own experience and from working with students over the years that particularly us Westerners, we want to read about it and get it.
Oh, yeah.
And not so easy, because a lot of the literature, the sutras, koans in particular, and things, they can't invoke the experience for someone directly, but you can get some intellectual understandings that are important, for starters anyway, about things like impermanence. Impermanence is very, very important, of course, in Buddhism, and I think a lot of people don't really, they sort of know it in a certain way. They know that things come and go, and they know that people die and are born and all that, but they don't have the direct experience of impermanence, where you see how all pervasive it is. That there's no fixed thing. There's nothing in the cosmos that has a permanent, abiding, permanent nature of any kind. And intellectually, I can say that, and we can kind of get that, but the sort of experience of it is kind of shakes you up a little bit, because you suddenly feel a little bit unmoored, you might say, or at sea, because at least that was my experience, not in a bad way, but it just, you suddenly realize that everything, there's nothing to hang on to. There's nothing to hold on to. And yet we spend most of our lives trying to hold on to all kinds of things, like a lifesaver, off a ship, or something that'll keep you afloat. And of course, this kind of clinging and grasping is the basic problem of suffering, of samsara, and trying to make things permanent that can never be permanent. Another one you can read about that's also has this same type of effect is, and it's said in different ways, but it's interdependent co-arising, or sometimes they call it dependent arising, or there's different kind of ways to say it. But this is one of Buddha's realizations, that besides everything being impermanent, everything is made up of just a conglomeration of other things. So intellectually, we can say, well, there's subatomic particles that are parts of atoms, and atoms come together and form molecules, and molecules form compounds, and compounds have chemical reactions, and in physics there's all these various forces, electromagnetic and strong and weak force and things like that, of subatomic particles. And and if you have a very deep direct experience of that, it also kind of shakes you up a little bit, because everything suddenly feels like you're in a dream, that nothing is in a way real. It's just all these different manifestations of, we don't even know what, it's just everything you look at is just made up of all these other particles and things. So it goes back to that thing of impermanence, where there's nothing, I can call this a mechanical pencil, but you could also say it's not that. It's just plastic and, graphite and maybe a little metal spring in there. And those all are made up of other things, and they're made up of atoms, and, and so you can look at the material world around us and see that not only is it ever changing, it's impermanent, but it's also not really what we name it to be. Okay. So when you turn this inward, then you have to start thinking about yourself, because in one way you can look at everything around you and go, well, that's okay for everything around me, but I'm permanent and I'm real, but then suddenly you have to actually take that in, that you also are the same, everything that I am made up of. I used to have, you've seen the chart of the elements, that shows, all the basic elements, 115 of them or so. Everything that I'm made up of is one of those, is a combination of those things. And even those things are made up of atoms and subatomic particles. And so, what's real and what isn't. And so I think in a college class, I don't know if they've even talked about those things. But those are some of the sort of mind or intellectual things that can be meditated upon and explored and gotten into deeper and deeper, till you have this sort of sudden awakening to the truth of those things. And then the truth of those things, changes you, and particularly when you start to understand what are the ramifications of this truth. What does this mean about me and my life and the world around me? And they're very big sort of realizations. And hopefully in that class, they may get into some of those things, because they are important places to kind of start from, that can trigger some beginning sort of awakenings, and some beginning sort of resetting your view of the world, sort of in accordance with those truths. And those have effects in your life, but it's a very interesting question. It's one that's debated all the time. And of course, there's a lot of koans. You see my Dharma name is Hogen, and there's a great story with Hogen, who was a great student of the Diamond Sutra, and he studied it his whole life and everything. And his teacher, Ryotan, he would go into Ryotan and ask him questions, and Ryotan would just say, he wouldn't even answer him. He would just say, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. And if they finally had an encounter where Hogen realized that it's not in the sutra, that the sutra wasn't going to get him there. He had a realization, and he took all of his books, all of his notes, all of his work that he'd done all these years, and he threw them in the fire. And he said, maybe that boat got me across the river, but I no longer need that boat. And now that I realized what it really is deeply in my body and in my, in my mind. And there's lots of koans about things like that. And there's all sorts of debates about it, but I kind of go with Dogen. I think you need both, and you need different things at different times. And, the koans are interesting that way, because they are kind of intellectual exercises in a way, except they can only be sort of answered non-intellectually. So there's a certain effort you have to make to get the koan without using your mind. And so it sort of forces you, because at first when you read a koan, you're like, well, you can sort of intellectually figure it out in a way, but you can't really present that koan as something you really understand from that explanation. If you come in like, the first big koan, the monk asked Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu said, moo. And so how do you present moo to your teacher? Well, you can say, well, it means this and it means that, and they're just going to pick up the bell and ring it, and you're out of the room, right? I mean, it's just that's simple, and so you just keep banging your head against it. But I don't know, it's not the easiest practice, and I think, and I sometimes I say, well, Westerners have a hard time with this, but I think everybody. I don't think it matters if you're from West or East. I don't think just because someone's born and grew up in Japan or China that they necessarily have an advantage in this practice, and of course in popular culture, Zen is always, it's pretty much considered kind of an aesthetic, I mean, a certain type of decoration and a certain type of ambiance, and that's just it's actually a Japanese aesthetic that we see oftentimes. And in the Chan school, in the Chinese schools, it looks very different, and in Tibetan practices, it looks very different, very colorful. The Japanese are very austere, black and white, so we have to just hack our way through all of that. And yeah, that was a long answer, sorry. But Juan, maybe you should talk to the professor and say, you ought to bring Genpo Roshi down here and have him do a class.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's why part of my arrogance from, I feel like, I'm learning from here. So I just feel like, oh, they are just playing those mind tricks. So I just feel, I notice my arrogance there. Like, how should I say it? Just really subtle. Like I thought, oh, I got it. Even this thought, just really arrogant. 就是 that's just I don't know how to say that loud. I just this week. I mean, last week when I still in that. Oh, I know it. But this week I noticed that last week I was like, I know it. But
Yeah.
who knows next week? Just so interesting to practice then. Like,
Well,
keep.
yeah,
I don't know. Just.
no, it's very interesting. I mean, the ego will appropriate your genuine enlightenment experiences or realization, will appropriate that to prop itself up. I mean, it happens all the time. I lived in a monastery for 7 years, and it was a very interesting thing to feel myself, trying to figure out where I was on the pecking order, with all these other monks who'd been there a long time. Or when new people came in, I felt superior to them, and I felt inferior to the senior monks, and of course the Genpo Roshi and all that. And when somebody would get assigned a certain position at the monastery, that like, oh, well, now I'm the chant leader singer, or I get to do the bell, or I'm the one that sets up the altar, or we have, they had all these. I mean, to run a monastery, you have to have people doing all sorts of different things, and even like the head cook, it was a very revered kind of position that people were, and there was so much jealousy and envy, and undercutting of each other, and all the normal stuff that goes on in normal society. It's all there in the monastery, and yet we, daily almost, or every other day there was a class where we were told that not to be that way. And you get prided. I mean, you go in and you do a koan and you pass it. If you don't pass the koan, you feel terrible, and if you do pass the koan, you get an ego about it, right? It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of self-awareness, to get to the point where you even start to notice where you're at. And then when you start noticing where you're at, then you have to fight off the the things that come after that, where you can even be proud of noticing where you're at, right? I mean, it can spin almost out of control. There's another wonderful koan about this issue, where Joshu's, it's another one by Joshu, who's got a lot of koans. He's, sweeping around out by the gate, of the temple and cleaning up and stuff. And this monk comes up who'd never been there before. And Joshu could kind of tell that the guy was pretty proud of himself and everything. And the monk didn't know who Joshu was at that point. But anyway, Joshu says, have you had your rice today? And the monk says, well, yes. And Joshu says, well, then go clean out your bowl. And of course, in koans, there's different levels, right? And of course, by asking if he'd had his rice today, he was asking, have you had enlightenment? And the monk was advanced enough to know that that's what he meant. And he said, well, yes, I have had enlightenment. And then he said, well, go clean out your bowl because you're still stuck to it. Your ego is all wrapped around how cool you are because you've had some enlightenment experience of some kind. So there's a great deal, most of the Zen that we're familiar with is all trying to get kind of new people into it and working on it and to have an experience. But post realizations, there's another whole series of training then. And it goes on and on. Genpo Roshi has always said, when you receive Jukai and you've sewn your little Rakusu thing, you're like a baby Buddha, and when you become a monk, you're a baby monk again. And when you become a sensei, you're a baby sensei again. And you have to kind of, and every time you just have to keep working on it. And even, I think, I'm trying to think it was Tozan, maybe somebody like that, who said, I want to get this right. Well, I can't remember it clearly enough, but basically, I know it was that, he asked the question, why does a fully enlightened Buddha continue to meditate? Because you're thinking, well, we're done, right? They're done. And of course, the answer was, well, that's because that's what Buddhists do. Because they know there is no final spot. There is no final landing spot. This is just another attempt by all of us to get to some ultimate permanent place where nothing changes and everything's perfect, which is there's no such thing. So if you're in it for the long haul, which means like to the death, and who knows what's beyond that. There's always more to learn, intellectually, and more to realize.
Yeah, can I have, one more thing, just like sometimes when I realize that, I notice that the huge sorrow or sadness there, just when I realize that. So I don't know, I just want to share.
I think, one of the other things that, well, I talked about, a realization of impermanence, a realization of interdependent arising, the realization of how our dualistic minds cause suffering. And then the realization from that every single sentient being has the same problem. And this brings up a great deal of sadness, but it also brings up a great deal of compassion, hopefully. And, we take vows to save all sentient beings because, not that we can do that, but we must try, And it starts with ourselves and with those around us, in a way, by not necessarily teaching them, but just maybe behaving in a good way, and being compassionate, without the slightest thought of reward for doing good. This is the kind of the bodhisattva vow. I mean, the bodhisattva is someone who is so realized they could just step over one final step and never come back, but they don't, because they've made a vow that they will not take that final step until everyone else goes before them. It's kind of a beautiful thing. And if that's a vow that we can think about every day, like, can we let everyone go before us? It does definitely bring up sadness and sort of grief for humankind, and it's sort of bittersweet, though, because you do see that there's a way out, which was, the Buddha's, the fourth noble truth is there is a way out. It's not permanent, but there's a way out, which is to, follow the eightfold noble path of right view and right action and right speech, right thought, right livelihood, right concentration, all those things. Very fundamental. The Buddha's very, very first teachings are still the most profound and most reliable and most foundational. And easy to read and easy to see and easy to kind of understand in a way, not so easy to do. Anybody else have anything?
Bruce, you remind me of Shunryu Suzuki, and his quote that I always go back to, which is, he said, technically speaking, there are no enlightened people. There is only enlightened activity, which I always keep reminding myself, because it's not about me becoming an enlightened person and being so cool. That has nothing to do with it. It's about my activity, which is something I always need to be reminded about.
Yeah. And so why would you say there's no enlightened people?
Because a person has an ego, and the ego is not enlightened. It's more about the activity, right? I mean, an enlightened person would have too much ego in it. But it's more of a verb. It's an activity sort of thing. That's my understanding of it.
Well, you're kind of half right. You're right about the activity part, but the reason he says there's no enlightened people is because to say enlightened is just a dualistic phrase.
Interesting.
That only means something compared to not enlightened. This gets into another realization that's very, very important that we can talk about, which is to understand really what a dualistic view versus a non-dual view really means, and what the ramifications are. So if you think of the entire cosmos exists as a non-dual entity. And by that, I mean that it doesn't come with any names. All the names we have for the planets are names that humans made up. All the names for all the stars, all the names and words for everything are a human invention, a human construct. So you know, a tree doesn't say tree on it, or it doesn't say oak tree on it, and your dog doesn't say dog on it. And, you know, this mechanical pencil, I mean, I made up that, you know, humans made up that name. Humans made up all these names, and all of these names are the dualistic world that we live in, that we're most familiar with, because everything has a name and everything can be compared or valued against something else in a relative way. This is the relative side, the dualistic side versus the non-dual side. In Zen, we are urging you to see everything non-dually. Everything. No names, no labels, no comparisons, no judgments, no values, no anything, because this is the actually inherent nature of the entire cosmos. This is much more true than any dualistic thing we might say about it, right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's just like, you know, John, if you and I went down to the art gallery and we stood and looked at a picture, you might say, oh, what a beautiful picture. And I might say, I think it's a terrible, ugly picture. But whatever we say doesn't make that picture different. The picture is the picture. Everything we say about it is just opinions. And opinions are dualistic. Now, I'm not saying that the dualistic world is not very useful as a human, because how could I even talk about this stuff? How could we even get along in life without, you know, naming and valuing things? But if we only do it that way, we're missing half the picture. And the same is true is if we see everything non-dually and not dualistically, then we're also missing that half of the picture, the other half of the picture. So how can we do both at the same time? This is what Roshi talks about when he draws the triangle, you know, the apex. You've got the dualistic on one side, the dual on the other side, a non-dual on the other side, and then you have the apex where both are completely embodied, and you see everything for what it is. So, you know, a good practice is to see how long you can actually look around your house or walk down the street or do anything from a non-dual perspective. And the truth of that is it's so vast, it's so all pervasive that it's like the realization of impermanence or interdependence, or, you know, these other things, and they all really kind of relate the same way. So, you know, I mean, if I say impermanent, that only means something compared to permanent, right? But we have to use words. I have to use words, right, to get these things across in an intellectual way. But and that's fine, and it can get you started, right? You can start noodling on it, like, wow, dualistic versus non-dualistic. How do I really understand that, you know? And so in your meditation, you can work on that. You can use that as your koan to like penetrate. How is it possible that the entire cosmos is inherently non-dual, and yet here I am thinking it's, you know, naming it everything and thinking that that's the only truth. You know, it's a bit of a folly, right? It's a bit of a I mean, it's a delusion, right? This is what the Buddha was pointing to, and he said, you know, delusion and clinging to delusions like that is the cause of suffering, because for every word there's an opposite word, and so there's a conflict set up. And my opinion is different than your opinion, and we're going to have little conflicts of some kind, maybe, about it, you know, not necessarily, but certainly you can look around in the world and you can see how differing opinions cause a lot of suffering. And even wars and horrifying things. But we don't want to throw it out, but we want to see it for what it is. And going back to your statement about enlightened activity is when you can see dualism for what it is and use it artfully. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. It's very interesting. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Gerardo.
Yeah, I think seeing the dualism also, in a sense, the being in the dualistic world is what shows us where our attachments are.
Correct.
If we're not in the dualistic world, we don't really know what our attachments are. If we're just in always a peaceful space, we don't get in touch with the reality, the brick wall, the other opinion, the other view, and we cannot see that, oh, I'm a little, this is making me wobble a little bit, you might say. It's like, oh, okay, I got a charge around that. We see those things and then we can just loosen it a little. But yeah. One thing that Desan Sanim said once is that understanding is illusion and not understanding is blankness.
Right.
It's like, what do you choose? What do you choose? In the end, we can read, we can try to understand, but no matter what point we get to in our understanding, it's going to fall short. It's not going to be complete. On the other hand, if we don't have any understanding at all, we just don't understand. We don't have a perception of that. We may understand immediate reality, but for me, one of the beautiful things in the Zen is just the question, what is this? Like you were saying, the tree doesn't say I'm a tree. The car doesn't say I'm a car. We create name and form, yet we live in that reality. But when we can take that moment and just look at everything and look at our experience in every single moment of the day, not just sitting on the kitchen or doing this or doing that, like every single thing that you do is your Zen moment. That's it. And another teacher of mine once said, like in Tibetan Buddhism, you have you go from emptiness to something, and then you go back to emptiness. And she would say, but Zen is just about function, correct function, moment to moment. So in each moment, how do you function in that situation? And that is your Zen. That is it, And so anyway, those are some things that were helpful for me.
Gerardo, very well said. Very well said. And I agree with all of it. And, you're right. You can get, we might say that for most of our lives, we're sort of stuck in the relative, but we can also get stuck in the absolute.
Mhm.
I mean, and this is why post realization or post enlightenment training is so important, because people get stuck in the absolute and not function very well at all.
Right.
Because like you said, it's in a way a kind of a blankness. You're disconnected. It's a beautiful spot because it feels really good,
Right.
which is partly why then the ego creeps back in and wants to even appropriate that, because you don't have all the pain and suffering of the dualistic world. Suddenly you're completely free, but you're also will act very clumsily and sometimes harmfully from that place.
Right.
And so this is why the post training tries to get you to bring the dual back in. And
Right.
sometimes it takes a while. The Tozan's 5 ranks goes on 5 stages, kind of back and forth until you finally can actually hold both and have enlightened activity like John was talking about, where you completely embrace both sides and you can function artfully as needed either way. But the main thing Roshi says all the time is don't get stuck. Just don't get stuck. Don't get stuck. And one of the monks that I lived with for a long time, Rich Christofferson, we used to have a lot of great discussions, and he says like the entire world is covered in glue. And it's so easy to get stuck. A little bit, a lot, medium, everything in between, we can attach or we can get stuck to. And we have to be sort of constantly vigilant, right? That's why I really appreciated what Hua said about, she's noticing these things. Yeah, you got to. That's what mindfulness and self-awareness is really about. A lot of the mindfulness teachers that I listen to and have heard over the years are, they're kind of focused on this kind of trying to notice every pebble in the path in front of you kind of thing, and it's, to me, it's different. It's much more internal. It doesn't exclude the external. I mean, it's very nice to be mindful, looking at a tree, mindful of the fact that it is non-dual, but it's okay for me to apply a name like oak tree to it, or to understand what vegetables I'm putting in the garden, or how to work my dishwasher or drive a car, or go to college. But it's slippery. It's slippery a lot of ways, but very well said, Gerardo, and I completely agree.
And one of those in the Lotus Sutra, it says, if you want to understand yourself, look at everything as created by the mind alone. Like that one sentence, because in a sense, our relative world, even though it's created by the mind, it has its own reality as well. It has its own cycle of appearing and then disappearing and all of that,
Well, and further, it has karmic consequences. That's how you know it's real.
Right.
When John talked about enlightened activity, well, that's all about karmic activity. And, that's one of the problems of being stuck in the absolute, is you kind of think nothing's real. And so karma doesn't affect me or anybody else. And the whole time you're doing that, you're creating all kinds of bad karma for yourself and everyone else, and because you've lost the grip on the karmic part of it. This is real. Cause and effect is real. And it's tricky.
I mean, I think initially for me, when I was a lot younger, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I started to recognize how my action, I started to recognize cause and effect in my life. I started to really see like everything in my life as having a cause. When things happen, I was able to see, oh yeah, this is related to that, and and I think that's helpful. I think even for the Zen masters, it's like there's that question: does the Zen master have karma? Yeah, I think the Zen master has karma too. I don't think that goes away. I mean, we all have some kind of karma, in a way,
Well, in every way.
Yeah.
The entire cosmos is nothing but a giant ball of karma that's impermanent.
Yeah.
And interdependent and constantly in motion. There's a physicist named David Bohm who came up with a great statement that I always loved, and he says, reality is unbroken wholeness in flowing motion. Beautiful, isn't it? Reality is unbroken wholeness in flowing motion. There's no gaps. There's no gaps in any of it.
Right.
Yeah. So I couldn't be here. I couldn't exist if the whole rest of the universe, if there was one thing missing in the universe, kind of, right?
Right.
That's the kind of the big view, right?
Right.
When you
Or
look
like the idea of everything is already complete, but we
Yeah.
just have a feeling that it's incomplete. We feel like it's not enough, but everything's already complete in of itself.
yeah, it's complete and whole, and no gaps and nothing missing. And there's of course a number of Zen statements about that all things transmit themselves clearly, that there's nothing hidden. It's just we haven't discovered something yet.
Right. I mean, there's many ways to say it, and the
Yeah.
Sufis who talk about lifting the veil.
Yeah.
It's like taking off the veil so that you can see. It's there, but we have these veils, and we're not able to see that we already are complete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the veil is basically dualistic thinking,
Right.
and how that ties into the ego, which is, when I said, I talked about impermanence, nothing's permanent and nothing's, everything's not made of anything, but that doesn't mean that I'm not here, Bruce, talking to you right now. It's just that I'm not a fixed thing.
Right.
There's no permanent Bruce or Hogen or whatever you want to call me, right? And so it's not that things aren't real, it's that they're not fixed. And so because they're always changing and because they're made up of all these other things, any kind of name we put on it is insufficient or incomplete, like you said, Jura.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, a certain focus is to find that completion or find the harmony. Like also the idea of harmony and disharmony, you might say. I mean, those could be like the voices,
Mm-hmm.
in moving toward harmony or moving toward completion, completing that which is incomplete in any way, whatever that is. It might just be a felt sense, but even as a felt sense, and even though it is an illusion to some degree, it is also something that you can work with, and it's real. It's like, I think one of the dangers that is to say, well, that's not permanent, that's impermanent, so I'm not going to invest in that. I'm not going to invest my energy in that because it's impermanent, it's relative, and so why should I put my energy? But I don't think that's the way. I think you have to be willing to invest in each thing,
Yeah.
completely.
Well, you would only say that if you're kind of stuck in the absolute. Well, everything's impermanent, so it doesn't matter. It's almost a nihilistic view.
Right.
Nothing I do matters because it's all just a dream, it's all just impermanent big things sloshing around. This is why you can fall back and forth, and this is why you have to get to this point where you can embrace it all, and then you can because you've seen the absolute, because you know what it is or have experienced it, and you've experienced the dualistic, you can then more carefully choose your words in the dualistic realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can more carefully choose your actions, and you can more carefully hit the mark, right, in your interactions with your coworkers, your family,
Mm-hmm.
the world at large. And even then you have to acknowledge that you're going to make mistakes, because you can't really see the complete effects of karma, or all the different karmic causes and conditions that might be affecting a certain situation. but you can do the best you can. And if you have a grounding in both sides, that's going to be your best bet.
Right, right. I mean, I guess, it's been said too that when things aren't clear, you can't really see. Like there's things that aren't clear in your life. Like maybe there's never a point when everything is clear and you're in your life and it's like, this isn't clear. It's fuzzy. I'm not getting it. In those moments, that actually can help you to be in the present moment, to just come into that. And many times those difficult moments in our life when we're faced with a real challenge or a difficulty, it really does put us into that awakened, kind of very alert and present state. I mean, that's what I've seen.
Yeah, for sure. And yet, the delusion that happens in the absolute is just that everything is so clear. You think everything is so clear.
Right, right, right.
And it is in a way,
Right,
but it's in a way that's missing the other half. There's one of the sort of poetic imageries in Zen is the hazy moon. And that enlightenment is a hazy moon. It's not a clear moon. And I think that's what you're referring to.
Okay. I don't know, but that sounds good.
Some of the
reflection of the moon, pointing at the moon.
Yeah, well, pointing at the moon is a different thing, but just the idea that we have this idea, I think, that enlightenment is completely clear.
Right.
And in the there's a chant that's done every day in Zen temples all around the world, called the identity of relative and absolute. And right in that it says an encounter with the absolute is not yet enlightenment. Because the encounter with the absolute, everything is completely clear.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not yet enlightenment because it's not hazy again.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to have that part. You can't disinclude anything. Right. And you referred a little bit ago to the koan about called Hyakujo's Fox, where the master is teaching and he notices this old man starts showing up in the back of the temple for the lectures, and he's wondering who he is, and he finally goes up to the old man after one of the lectures and says, who are you? And he said, I used to be the abbot of this temple 500 years ago, and a monk came to me and said, does an enlightened person affected by karma? And I told him no. And I was born in a fox body for the last 500 years. And, so I've finally been released enough to come to the temple and ask you the same question. And the master says, he says, is an enlightened person free of karma? And Hyakujo, the master, said, an enlightened person does not ignore karma. And that's a different answer, isn't it?
Right.
And it points to that same thing. And then the old man said, oh, thank you so much. He kind of in his fox body was kind of enlightened at that point, and they had a big funeral for him the next day. And there's more to the koan, but the essential point is, you got a long road, right? You got to get to absolute and kind of get stuck there, and then you got to get unstuck from that and get back to the relative, and that's going to feel horrible and like a backward step, and then you have to go back again and back and forth until it's so like I say, the vast majority of Zen students, it's the job of the teacher, and Genpo Roshi is so artful at this. With the big mind process is really actually revolutionary this way, that he can he can almost trick you or lead you into having a direct experience of some of these things without you even kind of knowing it in a way. But I mean, you see it at the time, but it's just a glimpse, it's a glimpse, and you got to keep going back and back and back. And but at least it's a glimpse, at least now you have some idea of the territory. But like Dogen says, and I believe too, that you've got to do both. You've got to study these basic truths and meditate on them and get into them, intellectually with the mind and the body, until you have these direct experiences. And so that's why we're here. We just been doing it for a long time, and I sometimes I look back and I think, God, I met Genpo Roshi in like 1996, right? And I came to a few retreats there and stuff, and I was, and here I am still kind of at this. And I guess it's funny because my wife and I met her there, and we've known each other a long time, but we're just like, oh my God, we're just so far away from getting it right, kind of. But then we go, well, at least we're just doing it, we got to just keep doing it. And when you get discouraged and when you don't want to, you're like, oh, something bad happens, you get a setback or something, you want to give up. It's like you got to just dig deep and go, no, I'm gonna read that book again. I'm gonna meditate again. I'm gonna come to classes. I'm gonna talk to Genpo Roshi, whatever it is, I'm gonna go talk to other teachers. I'm gonna find people that, you just got to press on, make it your life work, kind of.
I've heard it said that if you want enlightenment, you're very far away. So
Yeah.
in a sense, if you really want it, whatever it is, there's many kinds of enlightenment, whatever your desire, whatever you want or you're trying to, that in itself make it very far away.
Well, I mean, that's true. And that's a lot of places, that kind of thing. But I got to think how to answer this, because this can be a bit of a stumbling block. It's also said that there's actually nothing to get. And that is also true. And yet, you got to keep trying. And, you're right about your desire is going to get in the way of it actually happening. But if you don't let that desire push you, then you're not going to get it then either.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, these are the paradoxes in Zen. That's all over the place. And and the whole thing of, ultimately there's nothing to get goes back to the thing you said about there are no enlightened people. And that's true, because from the relative side, yeah, there are, but from the absolute side, there aren't. And right, and that you can't. How do you measure degrees of enlightenment? There's just no measuring stick for that. And that's what, when I was talking about being in the monastery and being jealous of the senior students and stuff like that, or the people that got to go get in and see Roshi more often than me, or things like that. It's like, I don't know if any of them were more enlightened than I am or less enlightened than I. This is something that's really a hang up in the dualistic world. And Dogen said, and Buddha said, and many people have said, you're already a Buddha, you just don't realize it. And that is true. The only thing between you realizing Buddha is to drop your dualistic thoughts of what a Buddha is, and any kind of images or or ideas that you have about what that even is. And it goes back to, like I was saying, the cosmos is a non-dual entity. You know, that's the fundamental truth. This layer of language that we've laid on top of this as a kind of map is just a human construct. And yet it's real because it has karmic consequences and all those kind of things, you know. But fundamentally, you're a Buddha. Fundamentally, the cosmos is non-dual. And so what's in between us and just realizing that? Well, thinking harder about it is not the way. And yet we have to study.
Mhm.
I think it was Tenkei Roshi one time said, you know, the world, everything is perfect exactly the way it is, and yet there's room for improvement. I
Right.
always love that, right? So the idea is not to get rid of the dualistic thing forever and just be stuck in the non-dual. That's not it. But you got to go from one to the next back and forth, and then it starts to make sense. And then you can truly live with enlightened action, like John brought up. Because basically it does come down to that. Since nothing's permanent, everything is action, everything is movement. So how can you move within that movement in a way that enlightens other people? You know, or at least lessens the suffering, or where you do no harm.
Right. Right.
You know, there's a lot of good things along the way, you know, that we can do.
Yeah. Doing no harm. That's a big one. I think
It is.
that's not an easy thing. It's easy to say do no harm, but really to do no harm, it's not that easy. It's not
No.
that easy.
Not that easy. You know, I mean, in the Tibetan school, they take that, you know, kind of to the nth degree, where if they're going to build a house or a temple or do, you know, disturb the soil, you know, the monks will go through and they dig down and they rescue all the worms and things, you know, and get them out of there before they pour any concrete or anything.
Right. Right.
And yet I mean, they do the best, you know, as best they can do, but just walking around, you know, you're killing everything you step on, you know. I always hate it. Like, we have snails in our garden, you know, around, and sometimes after it rains, they all come out and they, you know, I won't realize it, and I'll go out the front door. I'm in a hurry to get to my car or something. I'll step right on a snail and it goes scrunch under my foot, and I just like, oh God.
Right. Right.
You know, because they're kind of cute little interesting creatures, and I don't need to kill them. They're fine. I don't care if they eat stuff out of our garden, you know. It's just like, but we just accidentally, you know, we're clumsy in the world.
Mm.
You know, we're like a bull in a china shop most of the time.
And I think sometimes also we can, with each other as humans, you know, we aren't always skillful. You know, we don't even always know when we can be too strong or too, you know, we don't really know how other people perceive us necessarily. And I think that, especially living in a temple, you see that coming up, you know, because you're going to be in your space and your mindset, and other people are going to be around, and you're going to bump up against each other, and stuff is going to sort of kick off a bit. And you realize, you know, there's all this stuff going on, you know.
Yeah. I have witnessed fist fights between monks
Yeah,
in the Zendo.
yeah.
Right. I mean, it happens. And, you know, and it's because you know, we're so much driven by our selfishness, you know. I mean, the three poisons in Zen are greed, anger, and ignorance, right? So greed, we know it's selfishness, right? We look at everybody and everything around us as like tools. And anger, of course, the anger comes up, you know, when our expectations aren't met, you know, which are just delusions that we put out there. And ignorance doesn't mean stupidity. It means ignorant of these truths that I talked about earlier. Ignorant of the truth of karma, the truth of interdependence, the truth of, you know, cause and effect, the truth of impermanence. When you really get those things, it wipes away so much of this greed and anger that is pervasive in our world.
Mm.
It just burns it away, you know, weird way. And it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. Some of it can happen overnight, but sometimes it takes a while to kind of work on it because we have this deeply rooted patterns, right? And we still have to, you know, I still got to work. I still got to feed the family, you know, I still got to do all that stuff.
And for me, what I see, what I'm working on a little bit is just the anger that comes up when basically you're just doing the things that you need to do. It's like you're doing your job, you're doing your chores, you're doing whatever, you know, action in the world that's being required of it. How can you do that without being angry? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, how can you do what's just basically, it's not kind of something fancy or something special. It's just basically your human job without being angry about it, or without having this identity of I am doing this, or I did this, you know, and getting more toward the Wu way, the non-doing, you know, doing without doing, you know. That's a hard one, you know.
Yeah. And, you know, and being able to have equanimity and be able to take things in stride, you know, and not be phased, you know. And yet you know, you got to be able to hold your ground when you need to, and you need to surrender when you need to surrender. And
Right.
yeah, I don't know what the hell to do except get up in the morning and make breakfast, you know.
Mm.
It's so funny, you know, this sort of feeling of entitlement that I think that you're referring to, right? That we have, you know, that, you know, like my wife, you know, I feel entitled that she shouldn't leave, you know, some dishes laying around for me to wash. Right? I mean, it can be stupid, simple stuff like that, right? And or it could be really major things, but oftentimes the friction that happens between people is two people's entitlements sort of bump up against each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, well, I've gone a little bit over, but I sure enjoyed tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Really love your comments and questions. And you know, coming up, you should be aware, you know, we've got a 2-day workshop called How to Share Big Mind. It's coming up in a couple of weeks, I think. It's only $50 for the 2 days. Roche will be on both days. And if you get a chance, go to the website, come to that. I think it'll be really good. He's kind of really fired up right now. So, all right.
Thanks,
Good night.
Bruce.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks.
It's a great talk this evening.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you. I thought it was cool. You mentioned all of the Dharma names from the other day. Like you mentioned yours, and then the other people mentioned theirs, and just sort of, it was interesting to kind of to sit with that and to have that kind of aspect come up for somehow.
Good. Well, thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you. See you soon.
Good night.